Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to hear what students and youth have to say about the implementation of the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. My name is Aubrianna Snow. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Stakeholder Relations Specialist at Possibility Seeds. Possibility Seeds is a social change enterprise that works toward gender justice in institutional and organizational spaces. And we're so honored to be able to hold space today for student leaders and youth to share thoughts and calls to action on Canada's National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. Speakers will be presenting 10 asks today, which are essential for ending gender-based violence experienced by young people in Canada. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that this work is taking place on and across the territories of many Indigenous nations. The land I'm on is the traditional, ancestral, current, and future territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, and other Indigenous peoples. This territory is home to the Métis settlements and the Métis Nation of Alberta, regions 2, 3, and 4 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. This territory was the subject of Treaty 6, an agreement between Crown representatives and Cree, Ojibwe, and Assiniboine leaders to peaceably share and care for the resources of this land. European settlers broke this agreement. Over the past 2 centuries, Canada's colonization process has enacted systemic genocide against the Indigenous peoples of this land. We see these acts of colonization and genocide continuing today in the forced sterilization of Indigenous women, the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people, the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care, the criminalization of Indigenous people resulting in overrepresentations in prisons, and environmental racism and land theft of Indigenous territories. As we come together to respond to experiences of gender-based violence, we have to acknowledge this as a decolonial struggle. The two cannot be separated. We honor and take direction from the experience and wisdom of Indigenous survivors, activists, frontline workers, writers, educators, healers, and artists. I'll be here in a support capacity today, as well as to facilitate the question session that'll be happening after speakers have finished their remarks. If you're having any tech issues throughout, please feel free to message myself in the chat. And before I introduce our speakers today, I would like to let you know that you're invited to enter questions in the Q&A box throughout the press conference, and we'll pose these to presenters at the end. I'd like to pass the floor now to my colleague, Aryanna Chartrand, to begin her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Aubrianna. Hi, everyone. My name is Aryanna Chartrand. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm calling you folks from my campus today, located on the beautiful North Shore in British Columbia. It's the occupied and ancestral land of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I am currently the chairperson for the Alliance of BC Students, which is a coalition of student unions and associations across the province that represents undergraduate, graduate, and trade students. Like many student leaders and young people across the country, I was incredibly excited about the government announcing the Canada's National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. And this plan has been endorsed by provincial and territorial governments, who will each have the ability to determine what priorities and how the funding will be dispersed. But I'm here to tell you today that our provincial and territorial governments cannot forget about students and young people when implementing this National Action Plan. Our safety matters, and we cannot be left behind. So a couple of informational facts for you folks. Young people aged 15 to 24 are disproportionately impacted by sexualized and gender-based violence in Canada. In fact, we are the age cohort most targeted for gender-based violence and comprise almost half of the gender-based violence victims in Canada. Additionally, research by Statistics Canada in 2021 revealed that 3 in 10, which is almost 30% of women aged 15 to 24, reported having been subject to intimate partner violence in the past 12 months. And that is 41% of all police reports of gender-based violence that they originate with students. And we know that reporting doesn't accurately reflect, so the numbers are much likely higher than what I've just shared with you. And yet these numbers are still way too high. And so we need our provincial and territorial governments to make meaningful investments in our safety. Sexual violence does not need to be a part of the student experience. It shouldn't be a part of the student experience. And we need your support now more than ever. And so it's also been about 3 months since the release of the Our Campus, Our Safety Student Leader Action Plan for institutions and governments to address and prevent sexualized violence in Canada. We haven't received any response from our provincial or territorial governments, and we're incredibly worried that we'll be dismissed again when it comes to when it comes time to implement this national action plan. Specifically in BC with the Alliance, we took a delegation of student leaders from across the province to lobby decision makers at our legislature in Victoria. And one of our asks and recommendations was to integrate the Our Campus, Our Safety recommendations into the province's Sexual Violence and Misconduct Policy Act. And while there does seem to be general support for this across the legislature, there is an alarming lack of urgency when it comes to making these changes. The Our Campus, Our Safety Action Plan is one of many examples of students that they're doing the work. They've done the work. It is now on decision makers to take seriously our concerns and to begin implementing these changes for students. They're for students and they're by students, so they create an incredible starting point and a foundation as we tighten up our policies and make sure that our students feel safe when they're attending post-secondary. And so the Our Campus, Our Safety report provided 4 recommendations for provincial and territorial governments. The first one was to set provincial standards for campus sexual violence data collection in collaboration with key stakeholders. The second was to create and strengthen provincial and territorial legislative and regulatory frameworks to address and prevent sexual violence on campus. The third being to build provincial and territorial advisory committees on campus sexual violence with paid student representation. And the fourth was to ensure sustainable funding for community sexual assault centers and PSI sexual assault services. And so these asks provide a promising place to start for provincial and territorial governments in addressing the crisis of gender-based violence on Canadian campuses. And they do also align really well with the objectives of the National Action Plan. And so I'm happy then to pass it on to my colleague, Ziyana, who will introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Aryanna, and thank you everyone for being here. My name is Ziyana Kotadia. My pronouns are she, her, and today I'm located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape and Chinonton nations in what is colonially known as London, Ontario. I'm a student at Western University, and I'm the chair of the Safe Campus Coalition. And today I'd like to speak to you about the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence and to urge provincial and territorial governments to consider post-secondary settings when working to address and implement the National Action Plan. I'm really proud to be living in a country that has a national action plan to end gender-based violence. Yet, as a student and as a young person, I'm also concerned that this action plan doesn't effectively operate with consideration of the needs of young people who are, as my colleague demonstrated, disproportionately at risk for experiencing this violence. We know that post-secondary campuses are a frequent backdrop for instances of sexual and gender-based violence, and we need more action for addressing this ongoing crisis. The needs of students and young people need to be a key focus area in the implementation of the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence, given this disproportionate impact of gender-based and sexual violence on our lives. It's been really encouraging to see some positive steps towards addressing gender-based violence on post-secondary campuses in some provinces. So for example, PEI's NDA legislation, Bill 118 in particular, sets a standard to which policymakers across the country should strive in centering and protecting survivors. Banning non-disclosure agreements except when specifically requested by survivors is a step that all provincial and territorial governments need to take. This legislation is particularly relevant in post-secondary settings where power dynamics are complex, they're ever-changing, and the reputation of established professionals and the entire institution are at stake when issues of sexual and gender-based violence arrive. Bill 26 in Ontario, in my province, provides a promising start to work towards this, although significant amendments to that bill are needed in order to meaningfully protect and support survivors on campus. Other provinces and territories can take inspiration from the spirit of the bill. So with that, I am calling on all Canadian provincial and territorial governments to effectively ban non-disclosure agreements in cases of sexual and gender-based violence, except for when one is specifically requested by the survivor. Those affected by gender-based and sexual violence deserve control over their stories and lived experiences. And pursuing regulation of non-disclosure agreements is one key way that provincial and territorial governments can protect and support survivors' rights. We need action now. And this is one very concrete way in which governments can support us. Let's ensure the implementation of the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence prioritizes the needs of youth and students, Canada's most at-risk age cohort for gender-based violence. Thank you, and I will pass it on to my colleague, Jenna.
Hello, my name is Jenna Meier. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently attending Brock University. I'm a part of High School 2, which is a network of students, leaders from across Canada working to end sexual violence in secondary schools. I want to speak about the high school student perspective on the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. Sometimes conversations about gender-based violence experienced by young people get limited to the post-secondary setting, but I'm here to say that gender-based and sexual violence doesn't wait until youth walk onto a college campus. Violence impacts everyone of all ages, and provincial and territorial governments leave us vulnerable through decisions not to pursue generous and sustainable funding to school boards, sexual assault centers, and community organizations to engage in meaningful work to protect us. High School 2 has 4 main asks for provincial and territorial governments, which are as follows. The first is to provide sustainable funding for school boards to address gender-based and sexual violence. The second is to create and maintain provincial standards on data collection of sexual violence against high school students, both on and off school campuses. The third is to support Consent Awareness Week annually and provide funding for school boards to carry out programming. And the fourth is to ensure mandatory comprehensive sexual violence and consent education for all grade levels in every province and territory. These recommendations are key steps for provincial and territorial governments in ending gender-based violence at secondary schools, and they also support the recommendations brought forward in the National Action Plan. High school students need action from our provincial and territorial governments. It's so important that students learn about consent and sexual and gender-based violence as early as possible, and that high school students have access to resources and support on these issues. Far too many students go without the necessary education to advocate for themselves and are left with little resources to access when they are impacted by gender-based and sexual violence. And this is especially true for students in rural, remote, and northern communities. Provincial and territorial governments have the power to not only protect those affected by gender-based violence, but also to give students and youth the opportunity to become advocates for their own health and safety. Give our school boards the funding and direction they need to promote safe learning environments and to educate us on these life-saving topics. I'm calling on provincial and territorial governments to act swiftly to protect our safety. Keep high school students and young people of all ages in mind when the funding to address the National Action Plan is distributed. We deserve safe learning spaces, and sexual violence should not be a part of growing up in Canada. I will now pass it on to my colleague, Tera.
Hello, folks. My name is Tera Cardinal. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm currently a student at Mount Royal University, calling from the campus from the Student Association of Mount Royal University. I'm here today representing the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations, where I am the Director of Policy. The National Action Plan is an important step toward ending gender-based violence in Canada. In order for this action plan to be effective, provincial and territorial governments need to provide support and protection for students and young people affected by gender-based violence. This issue is urgent and costly. Young people in Canada don't have to face this alone, and provincial and territorial governments have the power to be there for our youth in times of need. We know that Indigenous people face particularly high levels of gender-based violence and sexual violence, and that this is no less true on post-secondary campuses. Many Indigenous youth have to travel far from home to seek a post-secondary education, and they deserve safe, accessible, and welcoming campuses, no matter where they choose to get educated. It is important that provincial and territorial governments pursue funding for research to action projects to address the issues of murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited plus folks, as it relates to the campus setting in every province and territory. This would build on the recommendations for the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and would also align with many of the points raised in the National Action Plan and other important frameworks. Many Indigenous students, survivors, staff, and faculty at campuses across the country are already engaged in this work off the sides of their desk, often with little or no institutional or governmental support. We deserve to be empowered in this work. To have consistent, generous funding with which to address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people from a campus perspective would not only help to build knowledge on centering and supporting Indigenous students and survivors, but would also provide latitude for Indigenous members of campus communities to focus on pursuing post-secondary education in a good way, unencumbered by the feeling that they must do all the work themselves to make campuses safer for Indigenous students. All students and young people in Canada deserve to feel safe, both in and outside of an educational setting. We hope that this implementation of the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence, provincial and territorial governments hear out voices and commit to sustainable action on addressing and preventing gender-based violence experienced by youth. By providing generous and consistent funding for those engaged in this work, developing good policies and the best practices, and centering the voices of survivors and experts are, without a doubt, the most promising routes which we can end gender-based violence in Canada. Young people are our future, and we will not succeed in ending violence if provinces and territories continue to leave us out of the conversation. Thank you, and I will pass it along to Aubrianna.
Thank you so much, folks, for all of those wonderful thoughts and conclusions. I'd like to move into some questions now. So I see we have a couple queued up. And again, you're invited to enter your questions in that Q&A box. I will direct this question, I believe, to Ziyana. I'm wondering, the question says, I'm wondering what the highest priority is for provincial and territorial governments to protect youth and what those actions should look like.
Absolutely. Thanks for that question. I think a really key thing at the provincial level is making sure there are standards for campus sexual violence data collection in collaboration with key stakeholders. These campus sexual violence climate surveys are really important tools to understand the prevalence, the conditions, and the environment where sexual violence is occurring more often, to better grapple with and understand student experiences of sexual violence, as well as also assess the effectiveness of institutional responses to continue to take action against it and establish improved supports for survivors. We've seen some individual post-secondary institutions conduct campus climate surveys, but Quebec and Ontario are actually the only two provinces to conduct province-wide campus sexual violence surveys. And I can speak to my context. I know in 2018, post-secondary institutions across Ontario participated in the Student Voices on Sexual Violence surveys. And this was a hugely valuable tool for student associations and for our institutions to better assess what needs to be done differently. So I would say provincial and territorial governments can support consistent data collection by requiring post-secondary institutions to participate in reoccurring and trauma-informed campus climate surveys.
Thank you so much, Ziyana. That's a great answer. I completely agree. We also have a question here for Aryanna. How can folks offer their voice to support students on this issue?
I think the first part of that is to listen to students. I think a lot, like we've been talking about, students are taking the initiative. We're the ones being impacted by this directly. And so we've come up with these incredible plans like the Our Campus, Our Safety plan that really map out how we want to move forward. And so by listening to students like ourselves and, going to your decision makers, bringing these things up whenever you have the opportunity, that's a great way to make sure that at least students are being brought up in tables where we're not invited. A lot of these decision making that happens in spaces where we are not necessarily included. And so if you do find yourselves in spaces where that is happening, just to talk about the work that's already been done. And I know for students as well, take a look at your own campuses or institutions' policies on this kind of stuff. I have the opportunity to work with various institutions and student unions, and I know that my particular university has an incredible work being done by some incredible folks, and some of the more rural, less resource, harder to access institutions are not that lucky. And so even just students talking with each other about this helps identify these gaps, and we can really share our resources to make sure that students are feeling safe.
Thanks so much, Aryanna. I'd like to open that question up to everyone, because I feel like there's so many ways that students can be supported in this work. Would anyone else like to chime in?
This is more reiterating what Aryanna said, but I really want to drive home the point that anyone and everyone, regardless of whether you are a student or a member directly of a post-secondary community, can be uplifting the recommendations that students have developed. Our campus, our safety student leader action plan has 10 really important recommendations for all levels of government as well as institutions. So help us uplift them by sharing them with decision makers who represent you. help us uplift them by sharing our communications on social media, talking to the people in your networks about why this matters, because this does matter. People's lives are on the line. Students' lives are on the line. This is affecting the generation of youth who are going to be building our world. So we need action on it. And one of the best ways that we can make that happen is if you stand in solidarity with us.
I would also just like to add in terms of the Indigenous youth population, I think it's really important that we need to destigmatize the conversations that's happening, especially around murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. It's uncomfortable to talk about, but I think it's something that we need to start talking about at home in classes with our friends to talk about how serious this is, because I know for myself and a lot of Indigenous young girls, the fear is definitely there that if something happens to us, if we go missing or if we're sexually assaulted, that it's not going to be believed or that no one really cares. So right now what we're seeing with Indigenous youth is they don't feel like their lives are worth anything to any level of government, because we're not taking this seriously. We're not taking the fact that a lot of girls, aunties and moms and cookums are missing right now or were murdered, and nothing seriously has been done to change that. So first, I think we need to have these conversations at home with the people we love to really bring awareness to the issue. And then once that happens, also talking to stakeholders to ensure that there is funding going towards research so we can address this. And hopefully we can start putting hope back into the young girls that they're not just going to be another number.
So beautifully said, folks. Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thank you so much to everyone for attending today. And don't forget to support students in these important asks as we work to end gender-based violence in Canada. Thank you.